Hi, my name's Peter Felsid. I'm the editor of IHS Jane's Defence Weekly. Towards the end of every year, we at JDW put together what we call our annual defence report. We call it the mother of all features because it takes up most of the magazine, but it does cover everything we think you need to know about the world of defence and military geopolitics over the last 12 months or so. We then run a webinar based on that feature to which all of our key subscribers have access. Over the next few minutes, you'll see some of our key staff outlining some of the main points from what we cover.
In the United States, throughout 2013, the Department of Defense's Pentagon complex has largely been occupied with discussion of the budget issues facing the U.S. military. Earlier this year, lawmakers were unable to reach a budget deal and therefore triggered the sequestration mechanism created by the 2011 Budget Control Act, causing a sudden reduction in the DoD's fiscal year 2013 budget that led to several days of furlough for civilian employees and that curtailed a range of training events for the military services. A base budget of $527.5 billion was enacted in FY13 for the DoD, but sequestration, according to the Pentagon, reduced that by $37.2 billion. The department has been operating in FY14 under a stopgap funding measure called a continuing resolution that funds it at about last year's level. However, the U.S. House of Representatives on 12 December voted in approval of a bipartisan budget deal that, among other things, would ease the effect of sequestration on U.S. national defense funding over the next 2 years by $31.7 billion. That legislation, which as of today seems likely to pass in the Senate, increases spending for FY14 and FY15 by raising the caps for discretionary budget authority in the national defense category of the federal budget, and this of course includes the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, Pentagon budget planners are trying to formulate their FY15 budget request, which is expected to mark a notable shift for the DoD. It will include a 5-year budget plan that comes as the United States is winding down the war in Afghanistan and as the White House is seeking to shift focus towards the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. military's future role in Afghanistan is still unclear. U.S. and Afghan officials had reached a bilateral security agreement that could ultimately shape the size and construct of the U.S. and NATO's post-2014 mission. However, Afghan President Hamid Karzai has since said he would not sign it for several months in an apparent attempt to gain concessions from the United States. NATO's mandate for operations in Afghanistan ends on 31 December 2014, and the alliance is working to determine the scope of a follow-on Operation Resolute support there. As operations wind down in Afghanistan, the Pentagon is trying to shift its focus more towards the Asia-Pacific region in accordance with the White House's 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance. Among other efforts to rebalance this military strategic focus, the Navy is to have 60% of its ships operating in the Pacific, the Army and Marine Corps dedicating tens of thousands of soldiers and Marines to the region, and the Air Force is basing some of its newest kit there. Pentagon officials have said the DoD's FY14 budget proposal seeks to support this Asia-Pacific shift by funding programs and activities that underline a larger presence in the area and enhance capability for countering anti-access aerial denial strategies there. Among the systems that officials have noted would be funded specifically for their utility in the region are the Navy's Virginia-class attack submarines, the P-8A Poseidon multi-mission maritime aircraft, MQ-4C Triton UAS, the Air Force's in-development KC-46 refueling tanker, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, an eventual new stealth bomber, and the U.S. Army's missile defense systems and precision strike weapons. DoD leaders have also suggested that they will seek to protect funding for U.S. Special Operations Forces, which are viewed as playing an increasingly important role as the military would like to continue projecting influence abroad even as it cuts its end strength from the services, particularly from the Army, and withdraws from some areas.
"2013 picked up on a familiar theme of declining defence spending in Europe. Spending fell across the board in most European countries, and we saw a significant readjustment in French outlook with the French budget law that was announced in August and has been going through the French parliamentary system throughout most of the summer. The budget law realigns French expectations based on a similar level to that we saw in the UK in 2010 with the Strategic Defence and Security View. The most notable casualty of that was Rafale production rates, which were cut from 11 a year, or roughly 1 a quarter, to just under 4 a quarter for the period up to 2019. One of the positives for 2013 was that we really saw Turkey emerge as a major defence industrial player. Turkey has invested for over a decade now heavily in their defence industry, in a comprehensive industrial programme organised by the Under-Secretariat for Defence Industries, their SSM. Early this year we saw the Anchor male UAV complete its flight test programme, and later on in the year we saw Turkey place an initial order for 10 systems. The Anchor is a significant milestone for Turkey in that it places Turkey above other Western countries in terms of its capabilities, with Turkey now the only European country to have a male UAV in full-scale production. This year also saw the maiden flight of the Herkush basic trainer. The maiden flight is significant in that it became the first locally designed manned aircraft that Turkey has flown since the MKEP Uyghur in the 1950s. Another positive was Poland, which we've seen also invest heavily in its defence industry and its defence equipment. One of the main themes of Polish defence expenditure has been a serious recapitalisation of its armoured forces, and we saw that with the order of 120 ex-German main battle tanks later this year, and also another order for 309 Russia-Nato APCs. The end of the year also saw Poland launch a major programme to replace its ageing Soviet-designed T-72 main battle tanks and BWP-1 infantry fighting vehicles. It's planned that both the T-72 and the BWP-1 will be replaced with a common universal chassis in a heavy and light variant. Relations between Russia and NATO continue to drop throughout the year and are now at more or less an all-time low, with the conflict in Syria proving a major sticking point between the two. NATO's ballistic missile defence programme in Europe proved another sticking point between Russia and the West, with the dialogue between the two effectively completely halting by the end of the year. Russia is fundamentally opposed to the BMD programme, which it sees as a threat to its own deterrent capability. As a result, Russia has also invested significantly in its strategic forces, and that's a theme we'll particularly see emphasised looking ahead to next year, where they expect to receive another 40 modernised ICBM missiles. Russia is also undergoing a major rearmament programme to make up for lost ground since the end of the Cold War. Russian defence expenditure is rising through the roof at the moment, and by 2016 will have trebled in nominal terms since 2007.
In 2013, in the Asia-Pacific region, there were a lot of carrier developments, submarine developments, and there were also a number of major fighter purchases. The key geopolitical events in Asia-Pacific in 2013, we have to start off with Afghanistan and the drawdown. As we come towards the end of the year, we've got President Karzai looking to negotiate a settlement with the US on what happens after the US and International Security Assistance Force troops withdraw at the end of 2014. So that's going to be the key event we're looking for into next year. Beyond Southwest Asia, we then have to look at places like Northeast Asia, and obviously the emergence of China is a trend that we've seen over a number of years, but this year was another example of what we might call kind of expansion of aims or expansion of its attempts to create a kind of a sovereign space in which it can act. One example of that was the announcement of an air identification zone around the East China Sea in December. That was criticised very strongly by Japan and the United States, and certainly was seen by them as a raiser of tensions. If we look at North Korea, which is always a perennial issue in Asia-Pacific and security issues, in March we had a nuclear test, which was a big issue for everyone, unsurprisingly, but there hasn't been very much evidence on what actually happened with the test. We just know that it happened. Towards the end of the year, we had a major purge of the number 2 in Pyongyang. How that pans out is another thing to look at in 2014. If we look across the Japan Sea, then we look at Japan, and Japan is in the process of reinterpreting its constitution, how it performs, how it acts militarily. That's certainly an issue looking forward. China is very concerned by that. The South Koreans are also slightly worried because, of course, they have territorial disputes with Japan. Some people say that Japan is rearming or remilitarizing. I think that's a little bit of an overreaction or an overstatement of what's going on in Japan. I think Japan is just kind of normalizing its behavior and finally moving away from a Cold War posture. There are a lot of carrier developments in Asia-Pacific in 2013. Russia finally handed over Vikramaditya to India. It's Admiral Gorshkov class aircraft carrier. It's 5 years late, but it's finally entered Indian service. India also rolled out its own indigenous aircraft carrier, Vikrant, which is going to come into service maybe in 5 years' time. But that was a big step for India. It's its first homegrown aircraft carrier, and that's a big deal. Liaoning, which was commissioned in 2012 by China, that had its first major deployment down to the South China Sea as part of a training mission. That was a big deal for China, obviously, and it also has a new dock down on Hainan Island, which suggests that it will be moving in that part of the world. Japan also commissioned a flat top. It's not an aircraft carrier in the conventional sense, it's a helicopter carrier, but that was its largest ship since the Second World War. There's another one of those in the works. If we look beyond aircraft carriers, there are a lot of interesting developments under the water in 2013, especially in Southeast Asia. In December, Singapore announced that it was going to buy 2 more new submarines. Vietnam received the first of 6 Kilo-class submarines, whilst Malaysia and Indonesia also are in the process of buying boats. Looking beyond that part of the world, of course, we had USS Freedom was deployed to Singapore by the United States. That's the first littoral combat ship. And there are also a number of developments in the air. If we look at South Korea, for example, South Korea had a major decision to make this year with the FX3 program. It looked like it was going to choose the Boeing F-15 Silent Eagle concept, but at the last minute changed its mind and has decided to opt for the F-35. Asia Pacific in 2013, key trends continued, but they were ratcheted up from previous years.
It's been another very eventful year for the Middle East. Ongoing conflicts in Syria, coup in Egypt, a lot of political instability still throughout the region, Libya in chaos, regional rivalries really playing out, and at the same time we also saw 2 potentially really historic agreements in terms of firstly to dispose of Syria's large arsenal of chemical weapons, but also the interim agreement to address the suspicious aspects of Iran's nuclear program. Syria dominated events in the region again in 2013. I think the Assad regime proved much more resilient than many predicted in 2012. One of the reasons for this is the amount of foreign support they're getting from Iran and especially Lebanese Hezbollah. We saw heavy fighting in Al-Qusayr with Hezbollah playing a very big role in that. But also at the same time you have Assad being able to mobilise his support base, especially amongst the minority communities, the Alawi, the Christians, etc., because of the growing Islamist domination of the insurgency. So they feel like if the regime collapses, then their communities will be in a lot of danger from hardline Sunni Islamists. At the same time, there doesn't seem to be any possibility of US-led military intervention now after the agreement to disarm Syria of its chemical weapons. We're in a situation where it's very difficult to see how this process could continue without the Assad regime being in place. And also the US and its Western allies are very reluctant to channel arms to an insurgency which is dominated by the Sunni jihadists now. And so essentially we'll see a bit of a stalemate for the rest of 2013. I think we're looking at a situation where, albeit the Assad and loyalist forces are making incremental gains in certain areas of Syria, they just are not going to have the manpower to reassert authority across the country as a whole. So we'll see that insurgency drag on for the foreseeable future. The Syria conflict is definitely highlighting the Sunni-Shia divide across the region. So you have Iran, the Assad regime and Hezbollah essentially on one side and the Sunni powers on the other. So this has become very stark in 2013 as the different powers support the different sides in the Syrian conflict. But the Sunni bloc isn't particularly unified, and I think that was highlighted again in 2013, especially over the coup in Egypt, where you have Turkey and Qatar being upset that the Muslim Brotherhood is basically deposed by the military, whilst Saudi Arabia and the UAE start bankrolling the new regime with billions of dollars in aid. So that was certainly an interesting development. So under the terms of the 24th of November deal on Iran's nuclear program, essentially what we're seeing is a situation that has rolled back their stockpile of 20% enriched uranium to 0. Now, previously it was a situation where that was steadily creeping up towards what the Israelis were saying it was a threshold for nuclear weapons. So now we have a situation where it will be extremely difficult for Iran to take the decision to start producing weapons-grade uranium without the international community knowing about it. So we're in a much better situation than we were before. This deal is intended to last for 6 months, but it can be renewed, and a comprehensive agreement will ultimately address all the concerns of the international community. And one of the issues is whether Congress will put new sanctions in place which could potentially derail this whole process. Now, if that does happen, we could see a lot of tensions building up next year if there isn't a comprehensive deal and more sanctions begin to get rolled out. Could be a very tense situation in the region. The reluctance of the US to go to war in Syria, the Washington's tepid support of the coup in Egypt, and its engagement with Iran have really irritated some of the regional allies, especially Israel over the Iran issue, and Saudi Arabia also over the Egyptian and the Syrian issues as well. Towards the end of the year, we saw a lot of people speculating about how US regional allies might be able to look to other ways to guarantee their security or move outside the US camp. But at this stage, I don't think we'd really expect to see too much diversification in arms away from what's already happening. The US does really remain the predominant military power in the region.
"2013 was very much defined by ongoing contraction, but also greater clarity. Now, defence spending continued to fall in the Western world. We saw sequestration in the United States, continued pressures in the European Union, but there was at least a feeling that the worst was known. And that was a big block to spending decisions in 2012. There was the feeling that there was a fog. The market was not sure which direction it was going to take. So if better times aren't immediately ahead, at least the worst is now known. Now, the way industry responded to that was interesting. We saw continued contraction. We saw tens of thousands of job losses in the Western world. We saw international expansion and diversification. Industry took a very strict view of what were core activities. So non-performing business units were cut. And it was almost interesting in what didn't happen in 2013. Now, for quite a few years, there's been an idea that consolidation is going to be a panacea for industry, particularly in Europe. That didn't happen. If anything, the largest prime contractors are coming out of this downturn smaller than when they went in. So businesses have continued to divide, they've split their interests, they've cleaved off entire units to react to the new market conditions. 2013 was defined by contraction and clarity. So defence spending in the Western world continued to fall, but there was a feeling that at least the worst was known. Now, the responses of corporations to this was predictable. So job losses continued to mount up in the Western world and international expansion continued apace. And it's also very clear that with the splits of the major corporations, the cleaving off of non-performing assets, the biggest players are going to come out of this downturn smaller than when it started. Well, looking to 2014 and beyond, now, greater competition is an absolute given. The Western world is looking to export its way out of trouble. We have a resurgent Russia and China. And also to this mix, we can add the emerging producers. So we can expect greater activity by South Korea, Singapore, Turkey. In the longer term, perhaps even India. So international competition is not going to go away. It's going to become even more intense. And to this picture, I think we can add disappointment. Now, the view that industry in the West can export its way out of trouble is going to be challenged. And likewise, diversification efforts. Now, we saw in the 1990s, during the downturn, industries both in the West and in the East and in Russia try to diversify to commercial markets, often with lackluster results. So disappointment could be a theme of 2014 and 2015. Now, in terms of acquisitions activity, mergers and acquisitions were very subdued in the defence market in 2013, at the lowest aggregate value that we've recorded at just under $9 billion. In 2014 and beyond, we see continued activity, perhaps by new market entrants, certainly China and perhaps many of the emerging markets too, pushing into the Western world, buying footprint and expertise. Well, looking to 2014 and beyond, we certainly see greater competition in the international markets. The clash between Europeans, Americans, and Russia and China, of course, that's a given, but we also see new market entrants. And likewise in the field of acquisitions activity, very subdued in 2013, 2014 and 2015, we see more buyers from the emerging world coming in.
So that was it for 2013. A year of challenges, certainly for Western armed forces with constrained budgets, but also perhaps opportunities for newly emerging export nations able to exert their capabilities. In geopolitical terms, it was also a mixture of challenges and opportunities. On the plus side, there has at least been progress on dismantling Syria's chemical weapons stocks, although the war itself seems likely to drag on regardless. There's promise of progress too with Iran's nuclear program, because that could at least remove the potential trigger for a major regional conflict. At the same time, however, territorial tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, a dangerously unpredictable North Korea, and little cause for optimism in Afghanistan as ISAF combat forces pull out from 2014, mean that the coming year is unlikely to be any more peaceful than the one just passed.